October 24th, 1946. A cold autumn dawn breaks over Prague. In the courtyard of Pankrak prison, the guards test the rope on the gallows. They are preparing to execute one of Nazi Germany's highest-ranking war criminals. The prisoner controlled a force of nearly 500,000 police officers. His subordinates murdered over 2 million people across occupied Europe. His name was Kurt Daluege. Most people have never heard of him, but on this morning, the hangman knows exactly who he is. The story begins 50 years earlier. September 15, 1897, Berlin, Kreuzberg district. Daluege was born into a Prussian civil servant family. His father worked as a minor government official. His mother managed their modest household with an iron grip. Young Kurt grew up in the rigid culture of Imperial Germany. Discipline was the currency. Obedience to authority was the highest virtue. He attended local schools. He performed adequately, but not exceptionally. He seemed destined for a quiet, invisible life as a middle-class clerk. Then came August, 1914. Everything changed. The First World War erupted across the continent. Daluege was 17 years old. He did not hesitate. Swept up in patriotic fervor, he enlisted in the Imperial German Army. He marched to the Western Front. The footage shows soldiers wading through knee-deep mud in the trenches. It was industrial-scale slaughter. Machine guns mowed down waves of infantry. Poison gas drifted over the lines. Artillery barrages churned the earth. Daluege saw it all. He was wounded twice. He received the Iron Cross Second Class for bravery under fire. He emerged from the war physically intact. But the boy from Berlin was gone. A psychologically hardened soldier took his place. Why did men like him turn to radicalism? They felt betrayed by the peace. The war ended in Germany's humiliating defeat. The Kaiser abdicated. The Weimar Republic was born from chaos and national shame. Daluege found himself adrift in a broken country. Hyperinflation destroyed family savings. Political violence erupted on the pavement. Communist and fascist paramilitaries battled openly in the streets. Germany's economy collapsed. Its pride was shattered. Into this void stepped the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis. They were led by a former corporal named Adolf Hitler. In 1922, 25-year-old Daluege made his choice. He joined the party. He received membership number 31,981. He was not attracted by sophisticated political theory. The Nazis offered something simpler. They offered culprits. They provided explanations for Germany's suffering. They blamed Jews, communists, and foreign enemies for stabbing the army in the back. They promised to make Germany powerful again. Daluege proved himself a capable organizer. His loyalty to Hitler was absolute. In 1926, he took the next step. He joined the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's elite paramilitary guard. He received SS number 1100, at first glance, a political club, but in reality, a dedicated terror organization. While others debated ideology, Daluege focused on logistics. He built structures, he recruited members, he helped establish the SS in Berlin. He expanded it from a small bodyguard unit into a significant street force. His administrative talents caught the attention of Heinrich Himmler. The future architect of the Holocaust saw a useful tool in the former soldier. Events accelerated. January 30th, 1933. The Republic fell. June 1933. Hitler seized total control as chancellor. The German democratic state collapsed in weeks. Opposition parties were outlawed. Dissenters vanished into the night. The machinery of a totalitarian regime began to grind. In this chaos, Kurt Daluege's career exploded. March 1933, he secured a seat on the Prussian State Council. June 1933, he was appointed chief of the Prussian police. His rise was vertical. By 1936, Daluege commanded the Ordnungspolizei, the order police. 500,000 officers stood ready in green uniforms. Was this just a standard police force? It looked like one. But in reality, it was an instrument of industrial genocide. At first glance, ordinary neighborhood beat cops. But in reality, mobile execution units. Most people misunderstand the Holocaust. They believe it was committed solely by SS fanatics in black uniforms with death's head insignias. But this is a misconception. Daluege's men were different. They were regular policemen. Many were middle-aged, fathers, husbands with families waiting at home. Yet, under Daluege's command structure, they transformed into mass murderers. Archival photos show police battalions standing over open ditches. Smoke rises from their rifles. The faces of the shooters look bored, not angry. Consider Police Battalion 101. Historian Christopher Browning documented their path in blood. 38,000 Jews murdered in Poland alone. These men were not born psychopaths. They were not sadists. They were ordinary citizens reshaped by the system Daluege helped create. Daluege established the administrative framework for slaughter. His officers guarded the ghetto walls. They dragged families from their homes during deportation roundups. They staffed the concentration camps. When Heinrich Himmler needed men for the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads operating in the Soviet Union, Daluege provided the manpower. Over 1 million Jews were murdered in the East. Daluege's personnel pulled the triggers. He did not hide from the reality. He attended the high-level meetings where the final solution was engineered. He received daily reports detailing mass executions. He knew exactly what his forces were doing. He approved every action. In internal memos, he demanded greater efficiency. He praised officers who demonstrated specific ruthlessness in killing civilians. Events accelerated. By 1942, Daluege reached the pinnacle of the Nazi hierarchy. He held the rank of SS Oberstgruppenführer, equivalent to a 4-star general. He sat in the Reichstag, the rubber-stamp parliament of the Third Reich. Himmler considered him a trusted colleague and a reliable executor of SS policy. He was untouchable. Then came May 27, 1942. May 27, 1942. A sudden explosion shattered the morning silence in Prague. Reinhard Heydrich, the acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, sat in the passenger seat of his open-top Mercedes. He felt untouchable. He was wrong. 2 Czech resistance fighters stepped onto the road, Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík. They were not amateurs. They were soldiers trained by the British Special Operations Executive. Their mission was suicide, but their aim was true. Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank mine at the vehicle. The blast was deafening. The rear of the Mercedes disintegrated. Shrapnel and horsehair from the car's upholstery tore into Heydrich's back. He did not die instantly. He collapsed in agony on the pavement. Doctors fought to save him, but the wounds were dirty. 8 days later, on June 4th, the blonde beast died from septicemia. How did Hitler react to the news? He did not mourn in silence. He erupted in volcanic rage. Heydrich was not just a general. He was the architect of the Holocaust, the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference. His death was a catastrophic security failure. It was a humiliation for the SS. Someone had to pay. Hitler summoned General Kurt Daluege to Berlin. The appointment was immediate. On May 28th, Daluege became the new acting Reich protector. His orders were explicit: crush the resistance, drown the Czechs in blood, make the population regret they were ever born. At first glance, a simple change of command, but in reality, a death sentence for thousands. Daluege arrived in Prague on May 29. He wasted no time. He unleashed hell. Martial law was declared across the protectorate. The streets emptied. The sound of traffic was replaced by the siren wails of Gestapo trucks. Police squads fanned out across the city. They had quotas to fill. Evidence was irrelevant. Guilt was assumed. Did you look at a soldier the wrong way? Arrested? Did a neighbor whisper your name? Arrested. Were you simply in the wrong place? Arrested? But this was only the beginning. Summary courts operated 24 hours a day. The legal process was a farce. The footage shows judges barely looking at the defendants. A name is read, a gavel bangs, a sentence is passed. Trials lasted minutes. Verdicts were predetermined. Execution followed immediately. The sound of firing squads echoed through the city day and night. In the first few days of Daluege's reign, over 1,000 Czech citizens were executed. There were no appeals. Photographs from the era capture the grim reality. Bodies were displayed publicly on the streets. They served as a macabre warning. Families were forbidden from retrieving the corpses. Mourning was prohibited. To cry was an act of treason. Daluege had terrorized the population into absolute submission. But he was not finished. He looked at the map and selected a new target. He ordered the operation that would define the horror of the occupation. June 9, 1942. German security police tightened the ring around the small mining village of Lidice. It was located just 14 miles northwest of Prague. The population stood at approximately 500 people. Nazi intelligence had received reports claiming the residents aided Heydrich's assassins. This information was completely false. It was a fabrication. But Kurt Daluege did not care about the truth. He cared about the message. Lidice was not just a target, it was a signal, a demonstration of total annihilation for any Czech community suspected of resistance activity. At dawn, the trap snapped shut. German forces blocked every road, every dirt path, and every forest trail. Escape was impossible. Soldiers forced the inhabitants into the village square. Panic set in. Men and boys over 15 were ripped away from their families. The women screamed. The children cried. But the soldiers pushed the males toward the Horak farm on the village outskirts. They lined them up against a barn wall. Mattresses were placed behind them to absorb the impact of the bullets, 10 at a time. The firing squads raised their weapons. 173 men were executed that day. The gunfire did not stop until the sun went down. Bodies piled up in mass graves. The women and children heard the shots. They knew exactly what the sound meant. But there was no time to mourn. All 184 women were loaded onto trucks and deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Starvation, disease, and hard labor awaited them. Many would face the gas chambers. Then came the selection of the children. Why were 82 children taken away? The Nazis sought racial purity. 17 looked sufficiently Germanic and were sent to German families for re-education. At first glance, a rescue. But in reality, a theft of identity. The remaining children faced a darker fate. Transports took them to the Chelmno extermination camp. There, gas vans finished the job. But murder was not enough for Daluege. He ordered Lidice physically erased from the map. German engineers arrived with explosives and heavy machinery. The footage shows walls crumbling into dust as charges detonate. They blew up the church. They filled in the village pond with rubble. They diverted the local stream to change the landscape. Tractors plowed the earth flat until nothing remained but bare soil. Even the dead were not spared. Soldiers dug up the cemetery and smashed the gravestones. The goal was absolute oblivion. Future generations were supposed to forget Lidice ever existed. They failed. The destruction of Lidice did not silence the Czechs. It shocked the world. Allied governments broadcast the details of the massacre across the globe. The Czechoslovak government in exile distributed the reports. In America, communities renamed streets and parks Lidice in defiance. The village became a global symbol of Nazi barbarity, and the architect of this horror was Kurt Daluege. But this was only the beginning. Throughout the summer of 1942, the terror intensified. Daluege continued his purge as the Reich protector. The Czech underground suffered catastrophic losses. Over 5,000 Czechs were executed during his tenure. Fear was constant. Every week brought new death lists. Every day brought new deportations. Daluege maintained this pressure until August 1943. Then, his body gave out. A massive heart attack struck him down. He survived, but he never truly recovered. The regime moved him to ceremonial posts with no real power. By 1945, the butcher of Lidice was a broken man, physically incapacitated. But his crimes were written in blood. May 8, 1945. 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the Nazi regime collapsed into rubble. Leaders scattered like rats. Some swallowed cyanide capsules. Others vanished into the countryside with fake papers. But Kurt Daluege did neither. Why didn't he run? He had the rank and the resources, but his body failed him before his enemies could. Severe heart disease pinned him to the spot. He remained in Germany while Allied forces swept across the country like a tidal wave. On May 26, 1945, British troops kicked down his door in Lübeck. There was no shootout. Daluege surrendered without resistance. He was too weak to fight. The British command immediately realized the value of their prize. This wasn't just a foot soldier. This was a man who commanded 500,000 police officers. He was an architect of the Holocaust. He was the butcher of Lidice. Events accelerated. The Czechoslovak government formally demanded his head. They wanted him to answer for the blood spilled on their soil. April 1946. Daluege was transferred to Czech custody. An armored convoy transported him to Pankrak prison in Prague. The irony was sharp. The same city he had terrorized 4 years earlier was now his cage. Czech authorities wasted no time. They charged him with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and mass murder. The trial was scheduled for October. Prosecutors had 4 months to prepare. They didn't need long. The evidence was not hidden. It was written in blood. October 16th, 1946. The Extraordinary People's Court convened. Presiding Judge Dr. František Slama led the panel. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating. At first glance, a standard legal procedure, but in reality, a reckoning for a nation. The prosecution presented a mountain of paper. Captured German archives provided a perfect trail. Orders bearing Daluege's signature, authorizations for mass executions, logistics for deportations, the administrative records of the Lidice destruction. He hadn't just given verbal commands, he had signed the death warrants personally. Then came the witnesses. The footage reveals the courtroom falls silent as the survivors speak. Czech civilians took the stand. They described watching German police murder their families. But the emotional core came from the women of Lidice. They spoke of the day their village was erased from the map. They described the sound of machine gun fire cutting down their husbands. They testified about the moment soldiers ripped children from their arms to send them to gas chambers. Women who survived the Ravensbrück concentration camp described the freezing cold and the starvation. Their words painted a picture of absolute hell. Daluege sat in the dock, listening. His health was deteriorating rapidly. He was 49 years old, but he looked 70. The camera records, a pale, drawn face and shaking hands. He wore ill-fitting civilian clothes, no SS uniform, no medals, no insignia of power, just a sick man in a gray jacket. Unlike other top Nazis like Göring, Daluege did not shout defiance. He did not claim ignorance of the events. He adopted a colder strategy. He admitted the actions. Yes, he ordered reprisals. Yes, he signed the papers. Yes, he destroyed Lidice, but he denied criminal intent. His defense was simple. He was a soldier. He claimed he followed legitimate orders from Hitler and Himmler. He called the massacres a military necessity in response to the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. There was no apology in his voice, no remorse. He maintained he had simply done his duty as a German officer. In the frame, the defense team points to medical reports. His lawyers argued that executing a dying man was pointless. They presented detailed evidence of his severe heart condition. They pleaded for imprisonment instead of the noose. The courtroom waited for the final decision. The trial moved toward its inevitable conclusion. 2 massive heart attacks. That was the medical defense the lawyers presented to the court. They argued his heart was failing. They claimed imprisonment was adequate punishment because his remaining lifespan was already short. Why did the defense paint him as a tired bureaucrat? They wanted to prove he only implemented policies. But the prosecution dismantled this narrative piece by piece. They proved he was not a paper pusher. He was a hands-on killer. There was no escape. The prosecution demolished every argument. International law was clear. Even in 1942, the Hague Conventions explicitly forbade reprisals against non-combatants. Germany had signed these treaties. The defense of superior orders provided no shield for manifestly illegal commands. Murdering women and children was never a legitimate military action. Daluege was not a mindless functionary. He held immense authority. He exercised it enthusiastically to orchestrate atrocities. At first glance, a sick old man, but in reality, a monster who enjoyed his work. October 23, 1946, verdict day. The footage shows the courtroom is packed to the walls. Spectators fill every bench. Many are survivors of the Nazi occupation. Others are families of the victims. The air is heavy. Judge Slama reads the decision on all charges, guilty. Kurt Daluege was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence? Death by hanging. The court found that Daluege had personally ordered and supervised the murder of thousands of Czech civilians. His responsibility for the Lidice Massacre was absolute. It was undeniable. As the head of the police, his administrative position made him responsible for every crime committed by the Ordnungspolizei in the Protectorate. His claims of following orders were rejected. The court deemed them legally insufficient. They were morally bankrupt. The judges determined that execution was the only appropriate punishment for criminality of this magnitude. The camera records, Daluege shows no visible reaction. His face remains a mask. He was escorted back to his cell in Prague prison. Under Czech law, he had the right to appeal. But everyone knew the outcome was certain. The evidence was too overwhelming. The crimes were too extensive. The verdict was too just. His lawyers filed the required appeals. The courts rejected them within days. Events accelerated. The execution date was set, October 24, 1946. Daluege spent his final night writing. The scratch of the pen filled the silence. He wrote letters to his wife. He wrote to his family. He requested a Protestant minister. The clergyman visited the cell and prayed with him. Prison records indicate the details. He was served dinner. He left most of it untouched. He slept fitfully. Every 30 minutes, the guards checked the cell. They watched him closely. They needed to prevent suicide attempts. The Czech government wanted him alive for the hangman. They demanded he face justice publicly. October 24th, dawn, 5 in the morning. The heavy metal door swung open. Guards entered the cell. They informed him. The execution would proceed in 1 hour. He was offered breakfast. He declined. The Protestant minister returned for final prayers. In the frame, Daluege stands in his civilian clothes. He wears the same suit he wore during the trial. He waits. It is 5:45 in the morning, 6 in the morning. At that time, the guards entered the cell, bound Kurt Daluege's hands behind his back, and led him into the corridor. The destination was the courtyard of Prague prison. This location was not random. It was the exact spot where the Nazis had executed hundreds of Czech resistance fighters during the occupation. It was a deliberate choice, a symbolic circle of justice. Why choose this specific courtyard? It would have been easier to do it indoors. But the Czech authorities wanted the ground itself to testify. The blood of the victims was still part of this place. A wooden gallows stood in the center. It was simple but functional. No elaborate setup, no theatrical stages, just a platform, a heavy crossbeam, and a rope. 50 official witnesses assembled in the cold morning air. Government officials, prosecutors, judges, and journalists stood in rows. But the most significant observers were the survivors. Among the crowd stood women from Lidice. They had survived Ravensbrück concentration camp. Now they were here to watch the monster die. There was no massive public spectacle. Unlike the Stutthof guards who were hanged before cheering thousands, this event was strictly controlled. It was witnessed but not turned into a carnival. The process began. 2 guards escorted Daluege across the stone courtyard toward the gallows. Prison records describe his movement, slow but unassisted. His physical condition had deteriorated during confinement. His face remained expressionless. If he felt fear, he did not show it. If he felt regret, he kept it locked inside. A Protestant minister walked beside him, reciting prayers in a low voice. Daluege appeared not to hear a single word. At first glance, a broken old man, but in reality, a mass murderer facing his debt. The executioner waited on the platform. He was a professional hangman hired by the state. Czech law mandated humane execution methods even for the worst war criminals. The technique was the standard drop hanging. It was calculated to break the neck instantly and cause rapid unconsciousness. It was a far more merciful death than Daluege had granted his thousands of victims. Events accelerated. They stopped at the foot of the gallows. An official stepped forward and read the formal execution warrant aloud. The document listed Daluege's crimes, the court's verdict, and the legal authority for his death. The reading took approximately 3 minutes. Daluege listened without reaction, his eyes fixed on a distant point above the prison wall. He did not look at the survivors. When the reading concluded, the official asked a standard question. Did Daluege wish to make a final statement? He declined. He spoke only 4 words in German. "I have nothing to say." There was no confession, no apology, no acknowledgement of the immense suffering he had engineered. Just silence. Guards guided him up the wooden steps to the platform. His heart condition made the climb difficult. His legs faltered. The guards had to grip his arms to support him. Once on the platform, they positioned him directly over the trapdoor. The executioner stepped in. He placed a white hood over Daluege's head, completely obscuring his face. He adjusted the noose around the neck. The knot was placed precisely behind the left ear for maximum mechanical efficiency. The witnesses held their breath. At 6:04 a.m., the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened with a loud crash. Daluege dropped through. The rope snapped taut. Contemporary accounts indicate the execution was performed correctly. The neck broke immediately from the calculated drop distance. The body convulsed briefly due to involuntary muscle reactions. Then, it went still. The prison physician waited the required time period. He stood by the gallows, watch in hand. After several minutes, he climbed a ladder to examine the body. He checked for a pulse and respiration. At 6:17 a.m., 13 minutes after the trap opened, Kurt Daluege was officially pronounced dead. The body was left hanging for the required period to ensure death. Later, it was lowered and removed to the prison morgue. Under Czech law, his remains were released to his family. This was an exception. Most executed Nazis were cremated and their ashes scattered to prevent their graves from becoming neo-Nazi shrines. But Daluege was buried in a family plot in Berlin. His grave remains unmarked. It was a deliberate decision by his family to avoid attention. Thus ended the life of the protector. 340 names. That is what remains on the bronze plaques today. The execution of Kurt Daluege closed a specific chapter of the war, but the crime itself did not fade. The massacre remained burned into the Czech national consciousness. 1947. The government made a decision. They would not just mourn, they would rebuild. A new village rose near the scorched earth of the original site. The murder ground itself was preserved as a museum. Today, thousands of visitors walk through the silence. The bronze plaques list every victim. Where homes once stood, a rose garden now grows. These are not ordinary flowers. They were planted with contributions from 35 different countries. Buses arrive every morning. Schools bring children to walk the grounds. Why bring the young to a place of death? It seems cruel, but the lesson is necessary. They see what happens when hatred goes unanswered. They see the physical cost of totalitarianism. Daluege's execution was not an isolated event. The Czechoslovak courts were relentless. Between 1945 and 1948, judges faced 700 Nazi war criminals. The verdicts were harsh. Approximately 475 received the death sentence. Not all walked to the gallows. Some appeals succeeded. Some prisoners died of natural causes in their cold cells. But the intent was clear. The nation demanded blood for blood. However, Daluege's case left a disturbing void. Questions persisted long after the body was removed. How does an ordinary man become a mass murderer? At first glance, a monster, but in reality, a rational bureaucrat. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted before the trial. The doctors looked for insanity. They found none. He was lucid, he was calm, he was not born evil, he was manufactured. The ideology of the time shaped him. Militarism and nationalism turned him into a weapon. He became a man capable of ordering the death of women and children without a spike in his pulse. Historian Christopher Browning uncovered the mechanics of this transformation. He studied the men under Daluege's ultimate command in Police Battalion 101. The archives reveal a shocking truth. These were not fanatical SS volunteers. The footage shows middle-aged men, some pot-bellied with tired faces. They were working-class draftees. Yet in Poland, they lined civilians up against walls. The officers gave them a choice. They could refuse the firing squad duty without punishment. Most stayed. They pulled the triggers, not out of coercion, but out of conformity. Daluege did not need to hold a rifle. He designed the system that made murder routine. His signature was on the orders. His organizational genius built the administrative structure for genocide. Paperwork turned into mass graves. He was the architect. The machine he built claimed over 2 million lives. The gallows leveled the playing field. Kurt Daluege died in public. He was no longer the powerful SS Oberstgruppenführer. He commanded no armies. He was just a convict in a prison yard. The camera records. The crowd watches in silence. The drop was swift. His death brought closure to some survivors, but it could not rebuild the burned villages. It could not resurrect the dead. This execution was a symbol. Rank provided no shield. The Nuremberg trials were happening simultaneously. A new legal standard emerged. I was following orders was no longer a defense. It was a confession. Daluege's trial in Prague hammered this into history. The era of impunity was over. The story of justice remains complex, but on that day, the verdict was absolute. One man on the gallows, that was the visible result. But behind Kurt Daluege stood an army of ghosts. Thousands of his subordinates never felt the rope. Officers of the Ordnungspolizei took off their uniforms. They burned their identity papers. They returned to civilian life in post-war Germany as bakers, teachers, and clerks. Why did the system fail? Justice demanded a purge, but chaos ruled the ruins. Archives were ash. Witnesses were dead or scattered across continents. Prosecutorial resources were almost non-existent. But there was a bigger reason. The Cold War shifted the target. The enemy was no longer Nazism. It was Soviet communism. West Germany needed to rebuild. It needed police, judges, and administrators. The Allies looked away. Denazification became a rubber stamp. By the 1950s, former party members sat in high offices again. They signed papers, they passed laws. At first glance, a rehabilitated nation, but in reality, a safe haven for criminals. Holocaust survivors walked the same streets as their tormentors. They stood in line behind them at the grocery store. German society stayed silent. It took 20 years for the silence to break. In the 1960s, a new generation started asking hard questions. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 finally opened the files. Lower-ranking perpetrators stood trial. But for many victims, it was 2 decades too late. Daluege's hanging also sparked a debate that outlived him. Does killing a war criminal balance the scales? Or does it just spin the wheel of violence again? Supporters called it necessary closure, a moral line in the sand. Opponents called it martyrdom. They argued it erased the chance to study the mind of a killer. Modern justice chose a different path. Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda banned the death penalty. The International Criminal Court allows only life imprisonment. The philosophy changed. The noose was retired. But in Prague, there was no hesitation. Czech historians viewed the hanging as payment for Lidice. It was not revenge. It was a receipt for mass terror. The execution proved that the untouchables could be touched. The footage shows the crowd watches intently. Faces are grim. No one looks away. For the survivors of Lidice, the feelings were mixed. Some felt relief. Others felt nothing. One survivor spoke to the press later. The execution did not bring back her husband. It did not raise her children from the grave. It did not rebuild the burned houses, but it sent a message to the world. The monster was dead. One rope, one drop. That was the only message the world needed to hear. It proved that immunity was over. But the lesson goes deeper than a simple execution. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. Look at Kurt Daluege. He had no horns, he had no fangs. In the archival photos, he looks like a bank manager or a mid-level clerk. Yet this ordinary man made the extraordinary choice to organize industrial slaughter. He did not stumble into it. He built the desk, sat down, and signed the orders. Why do these bureaucrats matter more than the madmen? Because madness is rare. Compliance is common. The capacity for organized murder did not die in the bunker with Hitler. It survived. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. The geography changes. The mechanics remain identical. In every case, ideology flips a switch. Propaganda turns a neighbor into a threat. Social pressure pulls the trigger. It is not a frenzy, it is a system. Administrative structures turn atrocities into paperwork, offices, files, stamps. Murder becomes a day job, and individual participation feels routine rather than criminal. The patterns Daluege established repeat across decades and continents. At first glance, these are security measures, but in reality, they are steps toward extermination. Recognizing these signs is the only defense. Dehumanizing rhetoric. The concentration of power without checks. Police forces transforming into death squads. Violence becoming the new normal. If we see the blueprint early, intervention is possible. If we wait, the camps open. Today, the site of Lidice is quiet. The memorial continues its mission. 150,000 people visit every year. Students walk where houses once stood. The guides do not just list dates, they explain the mechanics of hate. They teach how a society slides into totalitarianism. The lens focuses on the bronze statues, children's faces frozen in metal. A permanent testimony to 340 innocents. A village wiped off the map by a signature. But memory is selective. Kurt Daluege has largely faded into the gray noise of history. Outside the Czech Republic and specialist circles, the name draws a blank stare. He is not Hitler. He is not Himmler or Eichmann. He does not appear in the popular movies. But this obscurity is a mistake. He was the engine. He commanded the Ordnungspolizei. The largest police force in the Reich answered to him. His administrative work enabled mass murder across occupied Europe. The destruction of Lidice was his personal project. It became the shorthand for Nazi barbarism. We focus on the monsters at the top. We ignore the machine underneath. Genocide requires a pyramid. One dictator gives the order. Hundreds of Dalueges implement it. Thousands of officers carry it out. Millions of citizens look away. To understand the horror, you must examine the entire system, not just the figurehead. The execution took place on an October morning in Prague. The trapdoor opened. One man died. But the trauma did not vanish with him. In the memorial park, grass grows over the mass graves. 340 victims remained silent. The survivors carried the scars for generations. The hangman delivered legal justice, but he could not bring back the dead. October 24th, 1946. The clock struck 6:17 in the morning. Inside the cold walls of Prague prison in Prague, the trapdoor opened. The ropes snapped tight. Kurt Daluege, SS Oberstgruppenführer and chief of the Ordnungspolizei, was dead. He was 49 years old. The executioner's work ended the file on one of the Third Reich's most dangerous men. Yet, history often overlooks him. His death came 17 months after the German surrender. It was 4 years after he signed the order to wipe the village of Lidice from the face of the earth. 11 years had passed since he took command of a police force he turned into a machine for mass murder. Why is his name less known than others? He lacked the theatrical madness of the top dictators, but his quiet efficiency was far more lethal. Daluege represents the terrifying power of the bureaucrat. He did not need to pull the trigger himself. He used paperwork, logistics, and blind obedience to industrialize death. He proved that genocide requires competent administrators. He turned ideology into operational reality. The hanging provided a verdict, but it offered no restitution. The footage shows a landscape of total destruction. Where a village once stood, only flat dirt remained. Justice could not reverse the carnage at Lidice. 173 men and boys were lined up against the wall of the Horach farm. The firing squad fired until silence returned. 82 children were separated from their mothers. They were loaded into trucks and driven to Chomno. The exhaust fumes in the van suffocated them. 184 women were deported to Ravensbrück. They faced starvation, typhus, and freezing barracks. Most never returned. At first glance, a punitive operation, but in reality, an attempt to delete a community from history. The Nazis tried to erase the name Lidice. They failed. The village was rebuilt after the war. It stands today as a memorial of stone and defiance. It proves that a community destroyed by hatred can rise again. But the scars do not fade. This investigation concludes here. But the archives contain more documents. This channel tracks the darkest chapters of World War II. There is no sanitizing of the facts, no looking away from the uncomfortable details. The focus remains on how civilized societies slide into barbarism, how neighbors become perpetrators, how the innocent endure. Justice is often slow, it is always imperfect, but the record must be kept. Hit the subscribe button, share this evidence with those who value the truth. Leave a comment regarding the next case file. This is not entertainment, it is a necessary analysis of human evil. The executioners are gone. The responsibility to remember is ours.